All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Active Inference live stream. It is Active Inference live stream 13.2 on January 12th, 2021. Today's going to be a really awesome discussion. So thanks everyone who has come out to participate. Welcome to the Active Inference Lab. We are an experiment in online team communication, learning, and practice related to active inference. You can find us at our website, Twitter, Gmail, YouTube, or our Keybase public team and public username. And this is a recorded and an archived live stream, so please provide us with feedback so that we can improve on our work. All backgrounds and perspectives are welcome here. And as far as video etiquette for live stream goes, mute if there's noise in the background, raise your hand so we can hear from everybody who wants to speak, and we'll use respectful speech behavior. All the ActInf streams in 2021, at least the regularly scheduled ones, are on Tuesdays from 7 to 9 Pacific time. So check out this rb.gy link to see the schedule. Today we are in 13.2 on January 12th with Adam Safran and Colin DeYoung talking about this cool paper about cybernetics and personality. And next week and beyond, we're going to be heading into different sets of papers. So check out this spreadsheet and see if you're interested in participating.
Go to Dave.
Douglas, I'm retired from information technology.
All right, I just had to mute Douglas, so yeah, please don't play a stream while you're on a live stream. This is a Cognitio 2021, and this is a conference in 2021 that is being organized by several of our colleagues, by Mao and by Ines, who has appeared on the discussion before. Welcome, Blue. And so this looks like a really cool conference that they are all organizing. So check out this conference if you're curious, and hopefully we'll be able to have updates on this conference later on. So in the intro and warm-up session, we introduce ourselves. We can just give a short introduction or warm-up and then pass it to somebody who hasn't spoken yet. So hi everyone, I'm Daniel. I'm in California, and I'll pass it first to Blue.
Hi, everyone. I am Blue Knight. I'm an independent research consultant based out of New Mexico. Oh, and I'll pass to Stephen.
Hello, I'm Stephen. I'm based in Toronto. I'm doing a practice-based PhD at the Sullivan School Institute of Applied Psychology, and I will pass it over to Sasha.
Hi, I'm Sasha. I'm based out of Davis, California, and I'm a neuroscience graduate student. And I will pass it to Colin.
Hi there, I'm Colin DeYoung. I'm a professor in the psychology department at the University of Minnesota, and I will pass it on to Adam.
Hi, I'm Adam Safran. I'm a postdoctoral researcher out of Bloomington, Indiana. Good to be with you.
Cool, go to Alex.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Alex. I'm in Moscow, Russia, and I'm a researcher in Systems Management School. And I pass it to Scott.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Scott David. I'm at the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab, where I'm the director of the Information Risk Research Initiative. And I'll pass it to Marco.
Hi, thank you. My name is Marco Lin. I'm from Holland. I graduated in cognitive neuroscience, and I'm just very interested in active inference. I'm not affiliated at the moment, but happy to be here. Is there anyone left?
Okay, I had to kick out somebody who's doing feedback, so please have it figured out.
Yeah.
And yes, cool. All right, maybe not. All right, hello, Dave, are you there? Okay.
He just got disconnected.
Dave?
I am here.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, well, just proceed. I'll figure it out.
Fun. Great times. Thanks for being on. So for the warm-up questions, people can just raise their hand if they want to say something that's related or unrelated. The same questions from last week we'll put up and take a little bit of a different go at them. So what is something you are excited about today? And what is something that you liked or remembered about the paper? Anyone can go for it. I'd be curious to either of the authors. Just looking back on it, it's not so long ago, but we are in a new year. So with the fresh lens of the numerology of the year and just maybe these discussions, how are you looking back at what you had done and seeing it in a new or a different way? Or any other participants who want to add something that they thought of? Go ahead.
Oh, I might as well go ahead then. I was just going to say that I don't know that for me, maybe even more so than for Adam, this particular chapter was sort of right at the boundary of the things that I've been thinking about, and working with Adam has really pushed me into making contact with this whole topic of active inference and the kind of Fristonian world. And then it's also made me think more about modeling, because I've generally been fairly skeptical about the value of trying to model whole agents that are analogous to actual human beings for learning things about psychology, just because the brain and people are so complex. If you have a model, it has to have a sufficient degree of verisimilitude in resembling the thing that you're modeling before you're likely to actually learn new things just from studying the model, rather than learning about the limitations of the model in one way or another and your skill at modeling. But I guess one of the things that writing this chapter with Adam made me think about was Mars' different levels of analysis, and the way that if you get a good enough resemblance at the level of function or computation, you might be able to learn things even if you don't have verisimilitude at the level of implementation or algorithm, right? We don't necessarily have to say that the brain is doing the exact kind of mathematical computations that FEP demands in the same way that we would do them to model it. But as long as we're capturing something that truly resembles the functional computation that a cybernetic system like a human being needs to carry out, we might actually be able to learn new things about the way that people work.
Cool. Stephen, and then anyone else who wants to raise their hand, but just maybe we could hear from everybody in the warm-up. So Stephen, and then Adam, and then anyone else.
I'm really excited by the fact that this is taps into a very widely used tool in psychology. So, and then links this back to these new potentials of active inference, which we've talked a lot about maybe in more theoretical philosophical ways, but this really is showing how the twos can start to move into each other. So I'm curious today to see more ways in which there's questions about the potential for that going forward. What possibilities in the field of even organizational psychology, which uses these traits as well. These traits are kind of used beyond kind of work with sort of therapeutic environment. So and even with the Myers-Briggs and other types of things, how can a more dynamical kind of embodied, what's the future basically for applied psychology?
Cool. Adam, then Scott.
Oops.
So yeah, this actually working with Colin on this, it really stretched me also. It was at the limits of what I was used to thinking about. And I think I never really seriously engaged with personality science before this. I was always interested, but then I think I was also skeptical that they had any chance of carving nature at its joints. And I was just sort of maybe. But then as we started exploring the correspondences between the cybernetic view of personality and the other cybernetic perspective of active inference, I started to become more compelled. And then I'd say things are always kind of moving around for me in terms of uh, perspectives, but I think recently some of the things I've been thinking about is like how far can we stretch or apply these ideas of personality over what scales and what ranges of systems? Can we think of the personalities of societies, the personalities of any system? And so that's, I think, most recently been on my mind. But I'm excited to be here because I love these live streams, and last week was awesome.
Cool. Agreed. Scott, and then Sasha, then anyone else.
So a couple of things. The active inference is totally new to me and has really been revelatory, as other people have said. A couple of things. I used to work in identity a lot, still do. Identity, kind of system federated identity, kind of the technical stuff, not on the technical side. What I realized is the attributes are carried in these Markov blankets, right? So the access to attributes is through these statistical views of the surface of other systems. And so that's been really useful to me. And then the other part I realized that a lot of folks, Friston and others, are coming at this from the biology perspective of seeing, gee, how do these things emerge by themselves? What I realize is, as a lawyer, all I've ever done is construct synthetic Markov blankets, because contracts are revealing a surface of a system. In fact, the system doesn't exist until the contract exists. Forget corporations. If I want to put a supply chain in place, I write a contract, and then the organism of the supply chain exists as a result. And so it's funny, because in that idea of if it's too rarefied for viewing human mind, I get it. And it's interesting because in the de-risking context, where a lot of folks are getting together, they try to make it simpler, worry about bankruptcy, worry about notice, worry about these specific things, boom, boom, boom. That's all they care about. So it's kind of like a synthetic organism constructed by the contract. The Markov blanket defines the organism. It's like the opposite of the blind men and the elephant, where they're trying to find the elephant. Here, there is no elephant until there are their parameters. So the attributes define the system, and it's a very bounded system, very few attributes to it, but it simplifies it. And that's what a lot of regulatory market issues are about. So that's been huge for me, really realizing that we can synthetically construct these systems and base them on shared story, shared narrative, shared meaning. Contracts is a formal way of doing that, but folkways is an informal way of doing that. And I think that's absolutely a very rich avenue for my work, and I'm looking forward to working with others on it. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Sasha, and then anyone else on the warm-up. Yeah, Sasha, then Adam.
Okay. Yeah. Just really kind of following up on what Adam mentioned, thinking about other applications for the Big Five theory and what other groups and organisms they might apply to. And I think very relevantly for this group and of the kind of projects that we're working on is personalities of a team, and thinking about different behaviors. I'm sure this isn't a novel concept, but I'd love to hear more about it from the authors of other possible applications of these metrics for teams of varying sizes. And the other thing I've been thinking about since last week is this, if this paper aims to integrate these two concepts of active inference and the Big Five theory, are there parts that are incongruent? Is there something that doesn't, that can't work together from both of these systems? And is there something that active inference can glean or kind of take away from personality research in a way that hasn't really been tried before?
Cool questions. Thanks. Adam, then Blue.
Somewhat flipping what I said before related to what Sasha and Scott just said. So like in also not just applying personality to other systems where you might not normally think of them in terms of personality. I'm also interested in like reversing that flow. So it's like, how might we think of the personality of teams, but the things we know about teams, how might that influence how we think about persons and their personalities? Or contracts, like what are analogies or models that could be derived by thinking of what you described, this like enactive contract, like creating the Markov blanket of the contract in the doing. To what extent can we have this as part of person formation and person evolution, personality evolution? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's another place I've been thinking, is like this bi-directional flow of like taking things from persons, putting them in terms of things we might not normally think of as persons, taking things we might not normally think of as persons, and then putting it back to persons and their personalities.
Yeah, it's kind of like finding the human in the non-human, Adam. Really interesting point. So personifying and enlivening things that are perceived as inanimate, and then finding the mechanism inside of living systems too. So Blue, then Colin.
So going back to what Adam was saying, not just now, but earlier, and also just something that I liked about the paper. So for me, psychology has kind of always been like this soft science. Like you can't really do science on psychology, but really like what that means is that it's a wicked problem, right? It just falls into the complexity realm. Like people are super, super intricate, complicated. It's a convoluted like thing. So this paper for me really was awesome in the way that it kind of concretized or hardened up for me, like a quantitative way to really look at personality.
Interesting. Colin, then anyone else? And I'll put up the third question as well. But
well, first, I'm really glad to hear that this might have convinced somebody that psychology wasn't just soft science. It's definitely hard science in the sense that it's difficult. And that's largely about issues. Well, it's two things. I think it's issues with measurement, the kinds of measurements that we want to do and can do. They don't necessarily line up very well in terms of precision. And so, everyone has physics envy because you've got precision down to 10 decimal places on measurements. But, we're lucky if we have precision down to 1 decimal place, or if it's even clearer that our measurements are anything other than essentially heuristic. If you have a scale and you're measuring a personality trait, essentially what you've got is just a measure of people's degree of a particular kind of behavior or experience relative to other people. So the measurement is relative, and it's not clear that the 1 point on the scale actually corresponds to some true interval rather than just a kind of heuristic approximation. So yeah, there are a lot of really difficult challenges in psychology. But nonetheless, I mean, in order to do science, you just have to have some kind of standardized measurement and then be able to replicate, right, to see if other people can get it. I used to think that you had to have hypothesis testing too, but then I realized you can really just do science if you do exploratory work and then replicate it, because once you've found something, that then de facto becomes the hypothesis for the replication attempt. So all you're really looking for are reliable patterns in reality, fundamentally. And I think we can do that to some extent in psychology. I wanted to say something also about Sasha's question about the, whether there are incompatibilities between FEP and active inference and general approaches to personality and my theoretical approach specifically. And I think one of the things that's really nice about active inference is that it's very low level in some sense. It's this formalism that is extremely widely applicable. And the way that I see it is that it's essentially a formalism that captures the essence of all cybernetic systems. And so, I haven't found anything that makes me say, oh, this isn't going to work. It's like there's a lot of detail about what people are that isn't captured in active inference, but only because it's so low level. But like, there's nothing about active inference that isn't crucial to what people are, right? Because that the process of pursuing goals via feedback, that is just necessarily the core of what an agent is. And so I guess my concern isn't that there are incompatibilities. It is how to draw out the AI framework in such a way that it makes contact with a lot of the specifics that we know about humans function, rather than the generalities about how all cybernetic systems function.
really interesting answer. We'll go to Dave and then Marco.
Hi, my professor of cybernetics, Gordon Pask, in the 1950s and 60s, developed some very fine-grained measures of learning strategies, which is how individuals approach a specific concrete task as they're learning it, and learning styles, which is a more systematic way that folks develop a fixed repertoire of approaches to a task. The extremes of on that scale are serial learning and holistic learning. I believe the areas of his data where he uses entropy as an important measure for certainty and for tolerance for ambiguity should tie in with not the active inference, the other major area in what we're talking about, free energy. And I suspect that the learning styles should correlate with personality, and that is an area that I believe he Pask did work on. So that's something I need to dig into the literature on and compare it.
Cool. Marco?
Hi, thanks. Also, thank you, Scott. That was very well put. In general, I just really like a lot of things that have been said about active inference as a framework. I also echo the notion that the beauty is that it's so generally applicable, that you can kind of elaborate it, and that becomes a kind of game of, if you take a bit further with a few assumptions, when does it touch or overlap or align with other existing theories or empirical data? But what has been mentioned, and something I find personally an intriguing possibility, is not necessarily active inference, but if something like active inference would be true, and it would indeed be the most approximate description of our neural dynamics, then naturally follow that it also can become quite intuitive. So just like Colin said, that you can elaborate until it kind of touches something else in terms of theory, you could also maybe consider the idea that you can elaborate your understanding of active inference relative to personality or other psychological notions until it starts to touch your kind of folk psychological notions of people, of yourself, of others, society. And I think that's what I think someone in the beginning said. I think it was Stephen, about the future of applied psychology. And I think this is really, really crucial, not just from a scientific perspective, but also a social and a humanistic perspective. Because, I think most people agree that folk psychology isn't enough. And I think also most people agree that most scientific psychology, whether it's a neuro or a clinical side, isn't very easily implementable in terms of actual understanding yourself in a first person. So I think that's definitely the most exciting aspect. And I think this particular work is a very nice milestone in regards to that. I mean, I don't think anyone really understands themselves that much better with some ratings on the big five. But knowing the mechanisms, I think, is a very, very beautiful lens to understand oneself. So, cheers.
Thank you for sharing, Stephen. And then anyone else?
Yeah, sort of following on from what Marco was saying there is, like, the fact that this paper also takes in the affordances and active inference, like you say, does this dynamics. You gives this generative potential to the big five, which I know is kind of sort of seen to be there, but the challenge is that they can end up being, whether you like it or not, prescriptive and kind of diagnostic to some extent, and having a way to relate them opens up that phenomenological sense. Because I think what I'm really interested in is, if people structure their metaphorical models of how they cognize in the world, like whether they relate to time as time coming towards them, or they're going towards time, or whether they're trying to build a more firm career, or they're trying to get on in the world and travel and go somewhere. So those kind of phenomenological ways of structuring thought, they seems to be more ways that you can then connect them, as opposed to it being like completely disconnected or just too big a gap to bridge. So this this mixture of the affordances, the dynamics, the blanket and the attention, and the way that phenomenological sort of structuring could happen even at the individual level starts to become more plausible, which is kind of cool.
Awesome. Yeah, a lot of cool ideas coming up. One theme to return to is that by looking at the patterns and thinking about the frameworks that span different systems of different levels of analysis, we can think about like the traits of organizations, teams, individuals, organs, cells. So that's the multi-scale kind of complex systems approach, because we set out to look for patterns across systems. And then that led to all these interesting questions like, would there be a big five for teams? Or how are the generative models of individual personality related to the generative models or the generative processes underlying group personalities? And so pretty interesting things that we're coming to. Any other points in this intro before we just return to some of the later pages? Colin, go ahead, and then anyone else.
I'll just make one point in relation to this issue of team dynamics and personalities at other scales. That's something that there are different ways to approach it, right? So psychologists have certainly studied what happens to teams that have different characteristics of the individual members. And so you could think of, how do the personalities of individual members of a team influence the success of the team? So, for example, having people high in openness on the team tends to make it more effective in various ways. And it seems to be because of that's especially true for leaderless teams, right? So if you have it's not necessarily true if there's a clearly established kind of leadership structure in the team, but if you have leaderless teams, then having people who are more sort of cognitively flexible enables them to kind of organize themselves better. So, but I think that what we're thinking about here is something a little bit different. Like, is there a personality of a team as a whole that might be more than the sum of its parts? And they're probably going to be, well, you'd need to do a sort of parallel kind of research in terms of trying to come up with a comprehensive set of descriptors of the properties of teams, and then seeing if they varied systematically in the same way that people did with individuals, and leading to the big five. But I guess one of my intuitions is that the highest level of the personality hierarchy, stability and plasticity, which are also the most replicable across different languages when people have done the kind of big five research. So there's this very clear way in which what I think of as the two fundamental properties of all cybernetic systems, at least ones that have to be able to function in an unpredictable and complex environment, that is probably applicable at virtually any scale, even for something that might not be, well, I think it's an interesting question whether something like a team or a society is actually a cybernetic system itself, or whether it is an emergent dynamic out of a set of cybernetic systems interacting with each other. But regardless, I think you can certainly describe the stability and plasticity of teams, or even societies, right? You can describe them in terms of how much they focus on and value the lack of disruption of their functioning versus how much they value expansion and exploration and sort of dynamic growth.
Cool. That reminds me so much of the ant research. And do colonies have phenotypes, or is it just the phenotypes of nestmates? Does selection shape colony traits, or is it just shaping the nestmates and they're duking it out? So all these multi-level systems, we kind of can see these similarities. So Adam, and then Scott, and then anyone else.
So in relation to what Colin just said, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in terms of like cross-cultural, like the robustness, like, is it the stability and plasticity, like that level of granularity actually is what is the most broadly applicable in terms of like showing the least variation, like if you look at it in those two?
Yes. So in terms of the lexical research, like starting from a specific language and extracting descriptors and then doing the same kind of ratings and factor analytic work, the only truly universal solution that's been found is a two-factor solution, and those factors very closely resemble stability and plasticity.
Okay, so yeah, so that would support the idea that like if we're trying to do like a multi-scale personality story or a quasi-anthropomorphizing of quasi-agents, or maybe we should just call them agents, depending on our view, that yes, we will be most likely to find stability and plasticity. But because like you basically grounded the big five as part of cybernetic functioning, and if any like from an active inference perspective, if any like sustaining system is doing some kind of either explicit or implicit goal pursuit, we actually might find like even the big five itself like being surprisingly applicable, although like as you're saying, like it's an empirical question. And so like so I guess the idea is we actually do the research program of this sort of derivation of factors, and then we should expect to find things that might be shockingly like the big five in places where you might not expect them.
Nice.
Right. So
Go ahead,
sorry, I didn't raise my hand, but I just wanted to jump in and say, like, I think that the best analogy for that's going on in science right now is over the last, let's say, 20 years, people have really started to take seriously the idea of personality in other species. Now, I mean, whether personality is the right word there or you want some other one, it doesn't really matter, right? You have individual differences in psychological functioning of other species. And so people have been doing this, attempting to come up with extensive sets of descriptors of other species and ratings of them or coding based on video or observation or whatever, and then looking to see whether there are these similar patterns. And most of the big five are identifiable or fairly close analogs in other species. And the one that is the least commonly found is actually maybe sort of proof of concept in a way, because conscientiousness is the dimension that least appears in other species, something like conscientiousness. And in fact, the only two species where something close to that has appeared as its own separate dimension is in bonobos and chimpanzees, right? And so you think, like, what really makes humans special? Well, it's our ability to plan for the distant future and to prioritize goals that aren't immediate or near immediate, and to really have these elaborate goal hierarchies. And so it might not be surprising that it's only our nearest evolutionary neighbors that have these kind of identifiable patterns that are related to those abilities and that are separate from things just like how emotionally reactive you are.
Very interesting, Scott, and then I think Adam, and then Marco.
So this is great. One of the things I thought was interesting is, like, what gets measured gets done, and what gets measured gets seen. And so it's kind of interesting because it's like a biotheory of everything kind of idea here, and we're like, wow, this is really explanatory. My recollection is that quantum mechanics was just a calculation convention originally, but it kind of works and we kind of use it, and even though we don't understand all of it, it's kind of helpful that way. So it's not so much is it true, but is it useful? And this is broadly useful. And so it's interesting in living systems or cybernetic systems, we start to get at these questions we ask. And when we ask questions from I don't know, I'd like someone to tell me what the big five is after I make this comment, but if they're the big five of consciousness, then I always think of them as the accounting firms, but that's just because I was a lawyer for so many years. But it's like we're using the Turing test in a way. It's too much hubris about our form of intelligence, right? And so if we point our measurement instrument at a certain thing, that's what we're going to see. If we point our measurement instrument at human cognition, human consciousness, our sense of human consciousness, that's what we're going to see. And so this is a great discussion. To me, it's not a truth finding thing, but a usefulness of the paradigm kind of issue. And if someone could tell me what the big five are, just list them. That would be good, because I'm not familiar with the term as in parlance.
Sure. It's the big five dimensions that are empirically observed when you ask people personality trait surveys, and their openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, ocean. And then one metaphor on the big five, and it's kind of like the big five continents. That's what we have in the world as we have it. And so that is specifics. That's related to history, and that changes. But the principle is water and land. And so maybe in a different system, a different sphere with a different type of water level, you still would have water and land, but the actual number of big dimensions might be empirically seen to be different. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I think Adam, then Marco, then Colin.
I don't know if this would be useful, but perhaps in a bit actually might be good to have Colin talk about like the specific mappings of the Big Five onto cybernetic function that he describes in his original paper. That could be useful for people, but it's interesting about so conscientious like being less likely to generalize potentially across species or systems, because it seems like that makes some sense to me, and that in terms of preserving goal hierarchy integrity as you're confronted with all these different like circumstances, but you want to maintain this overall like broadly applicable goal hierarchy that's benefiting you overall. In order for that to be the case, you have to have a system capable of generative modeling with a certain degree of temporal depth and the policies it's pursuing in counterfactual richness, such that it could actually get itself into trouble and get confused and go down like wrong paths. And so you would expect this for all systems. You would expect this, you need a certain degree of sophistication, even maybe sophisticated effective inference, in order for you to really actually need something like conscientiousness. So that one actually might not generalize as much. And related to what Scott just said, there seems to be this interesting combination. It's like realist versus instrumentalist, or it's like you can think of like this personality is almost like the Big Five is like an effective field theory over persons, where it's a good approximate description, a useful course screening. But now the question I would have those, but is it like just completely? So there's a sense in which it's modular relative. It's based on our interests. But there's like another sense in which it's like, well, like what worked in evolution, and like and it's like you don't have to take the perspective of evolution, but we can all kind of converge on it. It's like quasi-objective. Like it's one of many perspectives, but it's a pretty darn good perspective, or an important one to keep in mind. And so in that sense, the Big Five actually might be carving nature at its joints in a really powerful way. And so I guess one more thing along those lines is I think it'd be good for probably Colin to talk about this since he discovered them, which is the aspects. And so one thing I'm wondering is, so it seems like in a lot of studies, when you do things at the level of correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of so the Big Five has this hierarchical structure. Over them, you'll have these two meta traits, which we've been discussing, of stability as shared variance of conscientiousness, agreeableness, and inverse neuroticism, and plasticity as shared variance of extroversion and openness. But then underneath the Big Five, Colin found that you'll get, if you if you let have the water level go, there's a down or up. I'm messing up Daniel's analogy, but you'll get two and only two aspects underneath each of them. And what's interesting is they oftentimes kind of read as being at cross purposes with each other. It's like these are very different things, not cross, but they're very different. It's very different to be like industrious versus orderly. Like these are very different ways of being in the world. Or if like you're neurotic, it's like very different of being like withdrawing or being like more volatile and like reactive. Like and so I guess one thing I'm wondering is like both in doing active inferential modeling of persons and trying to suss out personality, would it be better to actually in some ways focus on the aspects in terms of finding joints there, but also maybe across other cybernetic systems, like could there be more purchase from the aspects?
Cool. And I just flipped to the slide. So just for anyone can just say, go to this figure or go to this other thing. So Colin and then Marco. Sorry, you're muted.
Thank you for the reminder. So while there's a lot to think about in what's been said in the last couple of comments now, so in terms of this idea of continents and water and land, I do think that there's a way in which stability and plasticity are like the equivalent of water and land, so that pretty much any organism you're going to be able to identify, if there's any kind of individual variability, which of course there must be in order for evolution to proceed. Like, so probably, if you take amoebas, for example, they're not going to have a lot of different personality dimensions, but nonetheless, you might find some that are a bit more of the same species that are a bit more exploratory, and others that are a bit more cautious, let's say. So, even at this very simple level, you may get this trade-off between do you do things that keep your functioning running without disruption, or do you do things that lead to greater expanse and discovery of new resources? So those probably do trade off. I would hope that when we're within a species, though, that the big five are not like just the continents. In other words, they're not just a historical accident. I think that they actually reflect variation in parameters that have evolved and that are present in every intact organism of that species. The issue, though, in terms of carving nature at its joints is just that nature in this case is so complicated, right? So if you look at, this is a good figure actually that Daniel put up to make this point, which is that when we draw these kinds of hierarchical taxonomies of personality traits, they are necessarily oversimplifications, especially at the levels below the big five, because we know that personality does not have simple structure. And what that means from a factor analytic perspective is that if you took the taxonomy exactly literally that's depicted there, you would say, well, for example, no trait that is underneath extroversion, that's a subcomponent of extroversion, can be related to any trait that is a subcomponent of agreeableness, right? Because there are no lines connecting them in that figure. But in fact, the pattern of association and covariation among more specific personality traits below the big five is considerably more complicated than that would suggest. And so, for example, assertiveness is negatively correlated with politeness, right? So assertiveness is part of extroversion, politeness is part of agreeableness. Those are correlated with each other. However, it happens that the enthusiastic sort of sociable component of extroversion is positively correlated with the other aspect of agreeableness, which is compassion and caring about other people. And so you have two different components of extroversion correlating in opposite directions with two different components of agreeableness, and those end up canceling each other out. And so at the other level, you see no correlation between agreeableness and extroversion, essentially. So this whole thing, the structure, it looks simple in the picture, but it's a lot more complicated the lower down you go. And so I would have, it seems to me that these aspect level distinctions are important. They are supported by some behavioral genetic research, as well as some of my own research just at the phenotypic level. I think that they're probably the most important distinction within each of the big five in terms of discriminant validity. In other words, you often get things that are predicted differently at that level. So for example, politeness and compassion are the two aspects of agreeableness. And well, it turns out that if you look at people's political orientation, people who identify as more left-wing or liberal score higher in compassion. People who identify as higher in conservatism, more right-wing, score higher in politeness, right? So conservatives are more polite, liberals are more compassionate. Well, what happens when you go up to agreeableness? You see no correlation with political attitudes, which people found surprising for a long time, because it's, issues around altruism and cooperation seem very relevant to political issues and policy. Well, so it turns out that that's because something lower than the big five actually is associated with political attitudes in opposite directions. So I definitely think that these lower levels of the hierarchy can be useful. There's less, the evidence for the big five is remarkably extensive, right? Whereas the evidence for that next level down that I've worked on is much less extensive. Nonetheless, again, I think there isn't just one way to carve this system up, because the patterns of interrelatedness are so complicated. And I do think that these are useful subdimensions at any rate, even if you could focus on others. So I'll leave that there.
Cool. Thanks, Marco. Then Scott.
Thanks. So the last few comments were very, very thought-provoking. So let me know if I ramble on for too long. So I love metaphors, so if you don't mind, I'll try to provide a complementary one. So instead of maybe landscapes, I have this thing with imagining the brain as one big dynamical system. And so all those dynamical flows or patterns, they need to, of course, be patterned or ordered or structured in an adaptive sense. So this kind of tree-like structure could maybe be seen as a kind of grip, a kind of handle, a kind of heuristic well of gravity to kind of heuristically bias particular dynamics. And at least for me, that would make sense because of these big five factors being quite segregated in terms of where I think they would be relevant. And that leads me back to the matter of personality and kind of anthropomorphization, because I agree that there's a big problem of our theory ladenness in the manner in which we approach psychology. And that also should exhibit itself in, as mentioned, the observations when it comes to animals. But for example, when it comes to conscientiousness, as Adam already very nicely pointed out, there's the matter of temporal depth. And I think he did allude to it, but another thing to emphasize is also the kind of field or a range of possible alternatives to care about. So someone who would be low on conscientiousness or carefree would perhaps not simply be lacking goal-orientedness, but be more aware of, in touch, or have a bigger affinity with the notion of play, of simply engaging in behavior that is reducing expected free energy, yet not necessarily defined in terms of a particular goal, right? So not all animals would have to deal with that, right? Because the evolutionary simply are entrained or evolved to have awareness or sensitivity to a multitude of possibilities in what to do in an environment. And so the very emergence of a particular big five factor might be also related to the complexity or the kind of, the complexity of the imperatives that they may encounter in their life, in their niches. So one maybe interesting example is like dogs or other social animals, although in general, I don't think it would be appropriate to project or impose our anthropomorphic notion of personality. I do think at least dog owners can agree that dogs tend to have a personality that seems to develop or evolve and even seemingly be similar to their owners, possibly because the imperatives of their environment is expanded by being in relation with human agents. And so by the expansion of possible niches, possible situations, the relevance or the variation specific to why conscientiousness is a relevant factor becomes more apparent, whereas previously that might not be the case, if that makes sense.
Cool.
Yeah, and I'll leave it at that because I forgot everything else I wanted to say.
No, it's really interesting that it's Big Five is not the essence of an individual. It's actually in a cybernetic framework, making the individual's phenotype in relationship to the goals and their context of their niche. So it actually moves away from some of the essentialist types of critiques that people might naively bring up against Big Five. We're looking at this as an empirical pattern with a generative underlying cybernetic reality. So Scott, then Adam, then anyone else.
So fantastic conversation. The couple of observations. One, personality is for a person. And so it's kind of interesting when we take personality and impose it on other systems, right? I'm just playing linguistics there a little bit, but in a way, what is the delta between personality and living formality? I wonder. So that might be because are we assuming the human elements? Again, it's that subjectivity question. One of the things also, it occurred to me that Friston, it kind of allows for a notion of situated personality beyond situated cognition. And so maybe those are overlapping, maybe they're not. I'm not sure if all personality elements are seen as cognitive, or if there's some things that are, or affective and hormonal and whatever other causation chains there are. So it's interesting that the behavioral elements we ascribe to personality may or may not drive through all living systems. I tend to define living systems, and it's not anything reasoned. It's just what I've done for the last 10 years, and it's been effective for me, is I define living systems as autocatalytic and entropy secreting. So they can be in a variety of different forms. And so I think of markets and corporations as living systems. And so to me, one of the questions that with the definitions, in the Friston notion, we have kind of a fractal notion of things that are show scale independence, I guess, is one of the elements of fractal systems. And so to what extent can the definition of using these personality traits at different levels help us understand the scale independent possibilities there? So that's one issue. Then the last point, and these are kind of random, but I think they're clustered around the idea of the model scribing. The last one is, when we talk, if I'm talking to Daniel, there's at least 4 identities involved there: my sense of me, his sense of me, his sense of him, and my sense of him. So one of the challenges when you're talking to corporations, markets, maybe not dogs, because they may have qualia, is that the other entity doesn't have qualia. If you're talking to a corporation, it does not have qualia. The people in the corporation have qualia, but the corporation itself does not. And so or that's obviously, we can talk about that. But my point is, if they don't have qualia, can they have empathy? And if they don't have empathy, maybe there are differences in kind up the Friston stack of fractal stack of living things. And so maybe that is one way to start to distinguish between markets and corporations. And again, gets back to the animals issue. Do animals have qualia? Is the quality of their qualia slightly different than ours, such that maybe there's a subset of personality that they show, things like that. Anyway, just a couple of random thoughts, I think. But again, that definition of living beings, I think, is bound up in here. And again, not being too stubborn in our perspective that the personality is something that would describe all the attributes that work up and down the biological stack. Thanks.
Cool. We got Adam, then Stephen, Marco, Colin. So go ahead, Adam.
Hi. Okay, there's a lot to try to rein it in for me. I like what Marco was saying with this, basically this attractor network formation perspective, the supposed metaphor or really good model. He mentioned like niche construction, and he mentioned I think this perspective is really important in terms of thinking of the dynamic character of the processes that might give rise to these attractors over the course of development and situations, and with development potentially being understandable in an open-ended sense that never stops. And so I guess along those lines, I'm thinking of that causal process model that Colin has in the original paper, where it's going from genes and environment to you're having these cybernetic function and then traits and characteristic adaptations. But then there's this feedback and one way of understanding this feedback is as a kind of niche construction relationship, where you're modifying your environment, you're specializing yourself for these environments as you're trying to get along in the world as a goal-seeking system. One more, I guess, thing with relation to what Scott was saying, I think that's actually, yeah. So I don't want to also while I'm interested in seeing how far we can stretch personality, I wouldn't want to overstate it either, because there were major transitions in evolution, and one of them would be basically the ability to have certain types of generative modeling where there might be qualia and qualia of different varieties, and then we might go beyond that to not just qualia, but things like access consciousness, and if you like that distinction, I do, like being able to know your experience and report on it, and things like being autonoetic and being able to reflect on even your knowing. And so this would be very different cybernetic systems once you introduce this. So you can have and if you have something like the Big Five showing up, or the Big Ten, or the medium 10, I don't know what you would want to say, but they might show up differently. So you can think of generalized agreeableness as tendencies towards non-zero interaction and not defecting in generalized game theory, something like that. In a multi-agent context, you're more of a cooperator and you coordinate better. But very different thing if you're actually having something like the feeling of compassion or empathy. These are different processes getting into the mix, and yeah, you want a different handling, and some things might not actually. You want a very different handling.
Yep. Interesting. Like, would rather somebody act compassionately and be perceived as high percentile compassion, or perceived overwhelming experience of compassion. Stephen, Marco, Colin, Blue.
Yeah, this brings in the idea of how people relate in a task-based environment, or a more task-orientated environment, I suppose, where it might structure things a bit more clearly between the things in the world where the person is and whatever mechanism or structure is interacting between the two. Am I picking up a tool? There's some sort of delineation. And one thing that sort of comes to mind when we talk about, so you've got the generative model, you've got these hidden states of the world, and you've got this Markov blanket. And the thing with the Markov blanket is, unlike, it's not a system boundary, you never can really define it. So you've got this, and what I thought was quite interesting really, by having the stability and plasticity, I'm seeing sort of the plasticity with this extroversion, which you could say is like influencing the hidden states in a way. You're perturbing out there, and the intellect is making models, is the sort of the other side. But the stability in some ways is really stabilizing with the Markov blanket, like the nature of the regime, because you've kind of got, you know, neuroticism. Is it a very hilly landscape of actually like inferring? So maybe because I'm really interested in how we might have mental space psychology approaches, which there might be some sort of intervening spatial mediator to how we process, and that spatial mediator of how big and scary things are around us and in our metaphors, it could be sort of mediating. So the neuroticism, the agreeableness, the conscientiousness seem to have more structuring about how I might take data in through a Markov blanket to the other side, and the other two seem to have a bit more about what's out there and what's in here in a very crude way. But that's just something that came up for me. I thought it was really interesting. Cool.
Thank you, Marco, Colin, Blue.
Thanks. Yeah, I also want to build up on that. So I fully agree. So I think the prospects that are most attractive with this kind of approach to personality is, as Stephen alluded to, that you can associate these factors into particular imperatives, to particular challenges, as it were. And I think it's nice also to note to connect that with what was mentioned in the beginning about Mars levels of analysis. So Mars levels of analysis is a bit of a hot topic always. So forgive me, I'm a bit biased, but personally, I don't believe that active inference should be seen as quintessentially computational, because I think it would discredit the fact that it implies a lot about the algorithmic level. So just like Stephen kind of already said, you could have these intermediate spaces, right? And that's basically asking you how these computational imperatives or functions are going to be realized. And I really want to emphasize the notion of mediation, because I want to connect that to what Scott was talking about. So it should be emphasized that, from what I can tell, this model of personality is kind of neutral about consciousness, right? It doesn't. We should be very, very mindful about not conflating the first-person signs or perceptual models of how empathy arises within us with the process of empathy as such. Because if you see the process of empathy within the brain, then there's two ways to perceive it at the very least: third-person view from measures, whether physiological or questionnaires, and first person, of course. And it stands to reason that it's not necessary to have that first-person encounter with these processes for these processes to happen. But having said that, it would be very interesting to imagine that consciousness would be like a intermediating space as well, such that the component factors and the respective challenges of the Big Five can actually equilibrate, in the sense of it's not a trivial challenge to balance the respective aspects of these factors and the factors between each other for the autonomous being of concern. And so it would stand to reason that indeed there might be another intermediate space intermediating between these 5 factors, which would emphasize the cybernetic function of something like consciousness as a space. Which I think it might be interesting for you, Scott, because I think then you can generalize it for non-living beings or composite organizations. Because if you then associate personality as heuristics for certain domains of challenges or domains of imperatives, and then having to bind them together through a certain integrative space, then you could have, I think, a very interesting approach to organizational science, if that makes sense.
Thanks. That reminds me a lot of the projective consciousness model paper that we read in a previous ActInf stream, but it's almost like wondering if the cybernetic organisms or cybernetic systems other than organisms, if they have a projective geometry, do they also have that awareness? So Colin, Blue, Scott.
What I wanted to say actually ties in nicely to the point that Marco was just making. I was going to start by saying that I think it's important that the existence of personality is not dependent on the existence of qualia. So this is, I think, a mistake that people often make when they're considering the big 5 and similar personality systems. They think, oh, well, these are just about how people perceive themselves or about how people perceive other people. And maybe they're useful categories in terms of like what you need to know about a person. But actually the claim is that, assuming that these descriptions of people's behavior have validity, they describe patterns of behavior that exist regardless of whether people are accurately aware of them or not. And so you could have differences in, persistent differences in behavior from organism to organism in any species that would be directly analogous to what we think of as personality in human beings. Now, of course, it is true that we have this additional layer in which one kind of characteristic adaptation that we have is that we tell a story about ourselves consciously, and we can describe ourselves. And we actually make use of that when we try to measure people's personalities, because we often just ask them to describe themselves. But we're not interested just in their description of themselves as such. We're interested in, or we hope, and we know from a fair amount of evidence that those descriptions are reasonably accurate. So it's not just that I think that I talk a lot. I actually do talk a lot if you take some kind of objective measurement of that, right? That's part of what being extroverted is about. And so, consciousness is obviously something that, well, is mysterious in various ways. But I think that, if we focus on that division between the easy and hard problems of consciousness, I think we actually have some pretty important things to say about the so-called easy problems of consciousness, like how does it function, what does it do? And, I think Marco is right that one of the things that consciousness does is allow people to deal with conflicting information, conflicting goals, and to create a sufficiently broad model of the world and our attention of it that we can then control our attention effectively. I really like Jeffrey Gray's perspective on consciousness. His last book was just called Consciousness, Creeping Up on the Hard Problem. That's really excellent. And then I also like, what is his name? Michael Graziano's theory of consciousness. It ties in very nicely to this idea that a cybernetic system, to be a good cybernetic system, you have to have some kind of physical representation of the variables that are being controlled. That's the good regulator theorem. And so I think that one useful way to think about consciousness is as a model of our attentional field that allows us to direct our attention effectively to things that are important for our goals or things that are potentially conflicting between goals. And so in that sense, yes, it would certainly be relevant to conflicts that arise because of different needs or goals that are related to different personality traits. But it's not something external to the traits mechanistically, because the traits are descriptions of patterns of variation that, in a population. And so when we ascribe them to the person has a level of the trait. And so those traits actually should be reasonably comprehensive descriptors of functioning in all of the important, categories of human function, and that includes consciousness. And in fact, if you look at the contents of the big 5, openness and intellect is the trait that is really related to the qualities of consciousness. People who are high in openness are conscious of more things. Their consciousness is broader, it's deeper, it's more complex. And, so there's the openness side of that trait and the intellect side. And so you've got this sort of pattern detection and then pattern analysis. And all of that is basically about, in large part, the qualities of our consciousness.
Cool. Very interesting. Blue, then Scott, then Adam.
So I am going to totally bypass consciousness because it's just, it's a hard problem, right? But I do want to just consider for a minute, what would happen if we maybe mapped, like not asking what is a person, but what is an individual? Could we then like scale over like non-human systems, like, organizations, or even to other animals? Like Adam brought up like major transitions in evolution, and how do these like personality traits maybe influence evolution? That would be interesting to think about. Like, can we think of maybe clams as like ultra neurotic creatures and ants as like high in conscientiousness? Could we take like these personality traits and map them onto organisms, that have evolved over time, and what would that look like in terms of evolution, and what is essential? Openness to exploration is obviously key for some of the major transitions to happen.
That reminds me of the principal components, the big fives. They're based upon the patterns of empirical variation in the actual population, as Colin brought up. And then the animal spirits are, without making a metaphysical claim, they're like archetypes, like of bravery or of extroversion or a social butterfly or, a couch potato. It's still a living creature. It's a potato. It's in the ground. And so how we model different types of metaphors, it's like that's on our Procrustean bed. But then what does it look like to have it on their Procrustean bed for their personalities or individualities? So Scott, then Marco, then Colin.
Blue, I love the notion of neurotic clams. That's my favorite. This is great. And just along the same lines, a couple of things that leaped into my head. I was thinking of Irving Goffman stuff, where you project yourself out as you want to be perceived. So that's kind of, you're modifying your environment in terms of the persona perception. That was one thing. Then also a lot of self-other things in here, the identity kind of notion and that idea of presentation of self. One of the things I was wondering about is the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. DSM-5 just came out, and really how it plays into the what I guess they would define as anomalous persona traits. And usually DSM seems to be the ones that aren't the ones that make you not productive in a capitalist society kind of things, because there's a lot of things in there called cultural in there. But it's interesting that those are the outer bounds of what's expectations of persona. And I think a lot of the survivalness questions have to do with expectations and the rising of these variables in the corollaries in animals and in people have to do with survival, and increasingly in social survival, but also just that survival of the organism. And so that idea of presentation of self might be even related to camouflage and issues of that. How do you present yourself or not present yourself in society? So anyway, that host of thoughts, how that naturally evolved is kind of interesting. Also, this is not a studied thing. I'm not an expert on this, but just functionally, again, I think of the mind and consciousness. Well, I think put consciousness aside, just like Blue said, but I think of the mind as not in the brain. I think of the mind as in language and material culture, and the brain as an antenna tuned into the local mind. So if you're my sister adopted a child at the age of 5 months, and now she's was raised in central Pennsylvania, and she was adopted from China. She doesn't speak Chinese. She speaks Spanish and English. She's a U.S. person, but she looks like a Chinese person. So that their mind was developed in Pennsylvania. And so if there's no feral consciousness, which take that as an assumption for a second, or no feral mind, and if it's a learned phenomenon, it's interesting that we have this framing, and then we keep re-upping the framing, reaffirming and valorizing the framing. It's interesting to wonder if there's a lag in terms of survivability. What were the persona characteristics that were selected for? And I don't just mean in biological evolution, but socially. Are they identical to the ones that will be selected for in a much more dense interaction environment, for instance? So there may be some interesting questions if and to the extent that persona is not on board in the brain inherently, but is a learned social phenomenon. What is how malleable is it? And I mean, I guess that's what education is about, and why colonialists try to get indigenous people in their schools, their children in the schools early, to render the externality innocuous. But it'd be interesting from a perspective of current situations that we have in current policy challenges and public health challenges, et cetera, information challenges. How might we handle those, recognizing a more plastic persona? So just a few thoughts. Thanks.
Cool. Interesting. Marco, Colin, Adam.
Thanks. Wait, I forgot what I was gonna.
We'll come back. We'll come back.
It was after this.
Okay, Colin, Adam, Marco.
Okay, well, I think that there are certainly, it's certainly true that there are aspects of the mind and personality that are learned, but then there are others that are, evolved essentially and sufficiently genetically programmed that they would be present even in, feral children. But and that connection back to the idea of the evolution of personality, when Blue was talking about neurotic clams, I was thinking about some of the work that's actually been done on the evolution of personality in animals. Some of it is very interesting. There's a really nice paper from, almost 15 years ago now by Daniel Nettle that talks about the evolution of personality in humans and other animals. And so one of the things that he talks about are these experiments where you take a bunch of fish, and if you just naturalistically observe them, you will see that there are differences in personality. Some of the fish are relatively bold, some of them are relatively timid and cautious. And what you can see is that if you systematically manipulate their environment, you can actually change evolution of that population over time in interaction with the personalities of the individual. And so the way that I think about this is that personalities drive evolution, but evolution also drives changes in personalities at the population level. So what happens is that if you have those fish in an environment that has a lot of predators, then the bold ones get eaten, and the frequency of the more cautious, timid ones increases in the population. But if you put them in an environment that has very few predators, then what happens is that the bold ones tend to monopolize a lot more resources, and the frequency of the bold personalities increases in the population.
Yes. So always the ecological selection on the development of personality, not even just personality, something that can be reached out and grasped, but actually how personality becomes developed in relation. So Adam, then Marco, then Stephen.
Try to tie together a few threads before I lose them. So like earlier I was saying, evolution is one of multiple perspectives, but a really special perspective. And it is a really special perspective. It almost makes me move towards on some level I'm an instrumentalist, but with respect to the things like what is the ontological status of a Markov blanket, I think there is also a realism, a quasi-realism, and maybe a realism so strong we can sometimes throw away with the word quasi, although we should always kind of keep it in our back pockets. And that we should keep in mind that there are multiple ways of carving up the world, actually infinite ways. It's just some are going to be more or less good for beings such as us. And one really good carving would be the one that basically relates to functional cycles that achieve closure on time scales where they can be subject to cumulative evolution, broadly construed, whether being the development of the organism or phylogeny. And so what that might I'd pick out some particularly universally agreed upon, while still subjective, joints. But to kind of bring it together more, among those, and with relation to your personality characteristics, there's an interesting thing that can happen for species capable of modeling each other themselves with a certain kind of richness, having certain types of consciousness in the sense of knowledge, where, and even without it potentially, that they can become aware of these reliable course screenings of themselves and others. And then this forms a basis for your planning. And then this forms a basis for basically not just the niches that you're trying to construct, but the way your niche is constructing you. And so for all of this, like active inference with its like embracing of circular causality and this mutuality between like system and environment in terms of each being its own kind of active inferential system and exploring this interplay, I think that's really essential for understanding personality in both the specific and the general case. Before I let you all move on, like one final set of threads would be like when talking about something like consciousness. So like I recently kind of took on the hard problem. It is debated how much success I had, but in trying to make way on this, it seems useful to not, and probably with respect to discussions of personality, all of our words are just words. They're coarse grainings that we agree upon. And they don't exist in the world. And so consciousness, part of the issue is like we mean very different things when we use the word sometimes. And so similar, so you might say, as Scott was suggesting, like, we might want to distinguish between mind and consciousness, or intelligence and consciousness. And so you could say like your mind is distributed through the world and that your brain is an antenna. And I think that's a good perspective. But if you're thinking of like consciousness as like a type of model where there's something that it's like from the inside to be that kind of modeling process, that might not be extended. That might be like a subsystem and a submodel. And so similarly, we're kind of building up this onion of complexity with respect to consciousness. And people are kind of engaging at different levels, but not always being clear on the level that they're engaging at. And so you could, so recently I was engaging at the level of like basic phenomenality itself. And Rudroff and like the projected consciousness model, it's a very similar spirit. It's specifically what are the ways we can describe your subjectivity as a particular reference frame and point of view in the world as you as a cybernetic system? How can we characterize that? And so then we go like another level still, and we're getting to what Colin's talking about with things like attention schemas and like models of your awareness for modeling yourself and others in shared and shared attention schemas. And so I guess and we can go further still and get to things like self-consciousness, reflexive self-consciousness. And each of these will be kinds of major transitions in evolution and development, which I understand is a kind of evolution. And each of these will now dock with personality in different ways. Now, I guess the one final thing with that's interesting is the way in which personality traits, if you're thinking of them as kind of coarse grainings, it's like if it's like coarse grain descriptions. And so when can you coarse grain? You can coarse grain when you have something like a renormalization process, when you have some sort of like emergent attractor structure, such that the lower level or the smaller fluctuations, smaller dynamics can be kind of like averaged out, because now you're pointing at this bigger thing, and the bigger, slower attracting manifold didn't care about the particulars. So, or rather, that's not relevant for this coarser phenomena that you're trying to observe. And so there's a sense in which personality is a kind of coarse grain. It's like, what are the nature of these like normalization processes? And so one of them, it would seem like, so what is inducing this attracting structure? It seems like a good part of it would be so you can model yourself across situations. So you know, what kind of agent am I that I am likely to be doing what in what circumstances? And this will be pretty essential for pursuing any kind of complex plan. But similarly for coordination, or working around other agents, or cooperation or competition, what kind of agent is this I'm dealing with? But for the sake of cooperation, you might, ask someone to be responsible. They should be able to respond and report in a reliable and consistent way. We actually demand of each other in a way a certain non-erratic character. We demand dimensionality reduction of each other, just because otherwise we get surprised. And as the Fringy principle in active inference says, we don't like being surprised, because then we can't plan, and then we can't outsource our cybernetic entropy, and it's bad. So there's a sense in which, to what degree, like there's the same way that like personality traits are influencing, they're emerging from evolution and then influencing the course of evolution. With development, your personality traits are emerging from your interaction with your environment as you're carving out this niche. But also, they can also become like attracting targets in of themselves on different levels. Like if you have this expectation of yourself as being this type of agent, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think I'm a neurotic agent. I think I'm an extroverted agent. Now other people think I'm a neurotic agent. Other people think I'm an extroverted agent. And now they're treating me a certain way and I'm acting a certain way. And then this keeps going.
Yes.
Thank you.
A lot of awesome stuff. That reminds me of the scripts. It reminds me of the phrase, the common saying, the absolute power to act absolutely brings responsibility, or something like that, like power and responsibility. But now we're talking about the power to act and the responsibility to stimuli, and that means that we respond. So Marco, then Stephen.
Thanks, Adam, for that fantastic monologue. So first, a bit of a meta comment or question. So since you said we can't use the chat in stream, I've been putting some links in the YouTube chat, but I was wondering if you had a recommended way to do that, because a lot of people are mentioning a lot of interesting research, and I think people are modest to the point that they won't advertise their own research or link it.
Yep.
So what would you prefer, Daniel?
Sure.
I put some links to YouTube.
To respond to
Discord or...
Yeah, to respond to the meta, and just to clarify, so in the Jitsi for the live stream, it will make a whew if you use the chat. So it's very disruptive to use the chat during the Jitsi. So the single source of truth for the video is the YouTube page or on Keybase. So definitely everybody should make a Keybase username and join us at actinflab.public and check out activinference.org to find out more. But the Keybase at this point is our actual organizational hub. So that's where we're doing the open participatory Active Inference Lab. Like, this is a project of the communications branch of Active Inference Lab. Continue.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I didn't know what Keybase is, but thank you. Glad I asked. Yeah, so building on Saffron's great comments, so I fully agree that personality is definitely something scaffolded, right? Personally, I do see this the relevance of course grading, but I think it's also maybe interesting to use another example or metaphor of bootstrapping. So one interesting thing is, so in AI, they keep dealing with interactability, but clearly we are still living and not defying laws of computation. So there needs to be this kind of leap of faith of how to start off acting around in the world. And so one way to see it, instead of terms of course grading in terms of temporal scale, maybe it's simply, let me put it this way: if you're going to behave over time, across different contexts, there should be overlap in the kind of parameters or hyperparameters that govern your behavior or approach to the world. And those that are more consistent or more covariant or synergetic, they will consolidate into this kind of heuristic core to further elaborate and specify. And on top of that, building onto that, I was wondering, because Adam earlier asked Colin if he could maybe explicitly map the big five to mechanisms in cybernetic or active inferential terms. But I was wondering if it's appreciated or useful to also put that question for everyone, since everyone's relatively familiar with active inference or Fristonian terminology, how they would characterize the big five factors, because mostly it's in very simplistic adjectives or purely behavioral. But I think it would be interesting to maybe at least attempt faithfully to understand them from the inside out, right? What kind of functions or processes or inferential problems would be associated with them? A few people already did that, but I was wondering if people would like to do that more explicitly together, if that makes sense.
Cool. Great question. And also a lot of it is enclosed in the paper, which is why this is so fun to have as a journal club, because we can always superfluously add on top, but then the paper also references a lot of these things. So we'll go to Stephen, Colin, Scott.
Yeah, a lot of really cool stuff. I think, as well as the modeling idea, I think going back to this, the idea of a timid fish and a bold fish and the affordances of the environment. One thing that's really been striking me as has been trying to integrate drama-based projects and sort of experiential workshops with psychology is that you've got this kind of reflective perspectival aspect to psychology. Like you can take a perspective and reflect, and you get a sense of it. The Big Five will use that in the reporting. It's tapping into some subpersonal dynamics and other dynamics which may not be available at the conscious reflective level. And I think that then starts to get really interesting with the affordances, again, with the timid and bold, and what's been talked of how this all sort of scales, because it's not necessarily a timid generative model that creates the timid. Like if I take too many cups of coffee, okay, now I don't know if it's my brain that's changed or whether it's the sensitivity to my of my perceptual and action reflexes, which are kind of now, or maybe my stomach, or so you've got this. There's an interesting way with this that it can bring in the kind of the dynamics and the affordances, and sort of one thing that's quite interesting in theatre, you've got an acting method which is basically very, like you hear, very text orientated, and what did my character want to do. But another way is you just literally get into the body of an animal. So you be a spider, and they actually have in the Lecoq School, they do like a whole series of weeks in the zoo, and everyone has to be animals and inhabit animals' bodies. But there's something different about if you're on four legs and you're moving around smelling things, okay, you're going to be balancing your inputs, and your options and affordances for action are quite different, right? So it might well change the way, but it will change. Well, I'm not going to speculate on that, but just basically coming back to the point of the timid and the bold, and this idea that the way the active inference or the inactive sort of dynamics of the body with the environment can be, a lot of that could be sitting at a subpersonal level. Like you're not really sure how, that bright light has affected my retinal, or my tiredness has affected, or my alcohol consumption, some of these types of things. So I thought I'd sort of say that kind of can connect in with this, the more consciousness reflective piece, and the sort of phenomenological cybernetic subconscious piece.
Cool. Colin, Scott, Adam.
I just wanted to say that the reason that I didn't take up Adam's suggestion to go through each of the Big Five and talk about the cybernetic processes that we think are probably related to them is precisely that that is all discussed in the paper. I didn't want to take up a bunch of extra time with things that many people have already read. In terms of this kind of idea of the richness of the psychological processes that are underlying each of the Big Five, that is something that, it's true that a lot of people have this very shallow perspective on them, partly due to the way that they were derived in the first place and the stereotypes that people have about them as scientific entities. But I could spend the rest of the live stream talking about these processes in great detail, but I think it would probably be better just to refer people to the original paper that I wrote in 2015 on cybernetic Big Five theory. And then also maybe to a theory that we wrote on the cybernetic perspective on psychopathology, because the Big Five turn out to be equivalent also to the major dimensions of risk for different forms of psychopathology. And we talk a lot about the specifics that might be important there as well. And that all my papers, or most of my papers, are available on my website.
Cool. Great. And that's also why, again, the journal club format, it's not the only format we're going to experiment with in Active Inference Lab, but this will actually allow us to have conversations that are rooted in a lot of specifics, and various papers will be amenable to that in different ways. So Scott, and then Adam.
So, and I wanted to apologize for not having an opportunity to read the paper before this one, so I would have been better informed had I done that. I wanted to, it just occurred to me, something that might be going on here, and it's a little bit a stretch, so give me a second here. So this is going to be, where I'm going with this is whether living forms are entropy engines. Okay, that's where I'm going to go with this. So there was entropy, I'm talking about now, using Shannon and von Neumann and entropy notions generally, not by analogy, but rather saying, you're talking about general disorder. And so I'll be a little fast and loose with entropy for a second here. So Penrose wrote a book recently where he talked about what we get from the sun is not energy, but rather neg entropy, because the yellow light of the sun comes in, infrared light goes out. The difference is the frequency, and the information carrying capacity of yellow light is higher because it's higher frequency. And so it's a net energy neutral, except for global warming or climate change. But but what we get is the structure of plants reflects that higher neg entropy opportunity, I guess is one way to put it. So starting with that, what if entropy was driving a lot more? And so what if recall my definition of living forms as autocatalytic entropy secreting entities. So if entropy universally is increasing, living forms are localized neg entropy areas, right? They lower entropy locally and try to preserve it. What if the drive, both the physical symbiogenesis, where pre-existing bacteria migrate on board to eukaryotes and then become mitochondria in animals and chloroplasts in plants, so they come together because it's a better deal, basically a better way to be autocatalytic and entropy secreting at the larger scales. What if that extends to where we are now with what if those stages of personality have those functions? We're saying they do, and then it has to do with both entropy accounting. So when you're meeting someone who shares personality states or has predictable and personality states you can predict, there's a lower differential. So from a second law of thermodynamics perspective, you have, like for Carnot's equation, you need a hot and cold differential to perform work. What if the information differentials that you have between entities that are meeting each other help to cultivate various responses? And those responses we are cataloging in those 5 big persona traits. And so that's ways of being or ways of encountering. So it helps you navigate the social landscape. And what if what we have really is what I call an entropy engine, which is that the personality goes out and harvests disorder through these mechanisms, dissipating it, obviously, but also growing from it. And what I mean by that is all institutions, all of them, are de-risk some subset of interactions, whether it's grocery stores or hospitals or banks or whatever. That's what institutions do at larger scales. So they're neg entropy expressions at larger scales. But we have those feelers that go out, and maybe the personality types and our physical attributes are the feelers that go out to figure out where there's opportunities for proliferation into a community of interest around a shared risk. Thanks.
Wow. Very interesting with the Jordan Peterson, the darkness into light, ordering the universe and, disordered order as a thermodynamic inference process. So hopefully that will be something we can continue thinking about in our last 20 minutes. So we'll do Adam, then Marco, and anybody who's watching live can leave a comment. Anyone else who's on here can prepare any last thoughts, but this has been a super awesome discussion. So Adam, then Marco.
With relation to entropy, you might want to check out the work of, in terms of life, Jeremy England. He has a really interesting handling of that's free energy principle compatible of entropy maximization. And you might also enjoy Terence Deacon's work. Colin hooked me up with him. It's Incomplete Nature. He gets into discussions like discussions of autocatalysis, like Kaufman talks about, and work cycles as ways of describing systems and their reality. Because if you're talking about realities, differences that make a difference, being able to contribute to a work cycle is a pretty good criteria. And if we're able to identify a system on some sense, it's engaging probably in some kind of work cycle, and you can do an a handling of it that's going to involve entropy. Also, in terms of entropy, There is maybe two papers you might like. One is I posted them in the YouTube feed, which is Psychological Entropy from Hirsch, Marr, and Peterson 2012, and then a more recent Attitudinal Entropy Framework by Daleg, Borsboom, Harveld, and van der Maas. Forgive my pronunciation. But to now loop back around to some of the things that Stefan was saying, that still on some level of abstraction will involve entropy. One of the places I'm actually really thinking now into and trying to understand is the conditions under which personality might be more or less plastic, the conditions under which you can get trait change, altered traits, and not just altered states. And along these lines, so notions of like acting, like technical acting versus method acting, like to what extent is this sort of self-fulfilling, like this self-perpetuating attractor dynamic that makes up persons and their personalities, to what extent is it changeable, even if there are these enduring cybernetic parameters? To what extent can you take those arrows in Collins' causal diagram and really work them? So Collins basically talked about, like, if you want to have in his well-being work and his psychopathology work about character adaptations being where you have the most leverage, like the things you tend to do, this like design of your life and the situations you show up in and how you show up. And this is where you, like, or clinicians and yourself, you might have the greatest purchase in enacting change. And so this would work on multiple levels. One would be like, it would change the nature of what you experience. And, you know, we're learners, we update. It would also change your niche construction. It would change the way that the context in which you're in, if you that would be leverage there. But I guess one more thought would be, and to bring it back to consciousness, like, to what extent it's not just to change your characteristic adaptations would be to change the things you tend to do. But what you're describing, this sort of like method acting view, or you bringing that up of like acting, to what extent can personality be changed by really paying close attention to this, what is it like to be me, and actually and what could it be like to be a different kind of me, and then imagining yourself in that way. I wouldn't quite call it faking it till you make it, but like, and to what degree is this a substantial part of how personality forms to begin with? Like children at play, copying their parents, pretending to be this way or that way. But now the question I would have is, in the bootstrapping, can we still leverage this as adults? And one thing along those lines would be, that makes me think you might be able to. I believe in the Tibetan tradition, they'll, I think it's part of Dzogchen, I don't know how to pronounce it, but basically, they'll do these kinds of like deity practices where, like, let's say you have some kind of like affliction, something that's like not working for you. You might pretend to be a kind of complementary deity or spirit, but you don't pull this off on your own, like the social context. And so you create this kind of sub-persona that you live into. I believe they call it a tulpa. Marco, I think, actually pointed me to this. But you don't do it on your own. You have a holding environment, a social context that supports your act. And you're able to kind of collaboratively enact it. And that seems to be, to the degree this is, we can, you know, empirically establish this as a mechanism of personality change. This seems to be part of what makes the magic happen. So, yeah, that's the things I'm sort of thinking into, like, what are all of the levers we have to actually design our personalities going forward? So, you know, what mental techniques, you know, psychedelics like meditation, what's at our disposal so that we can have, like, you know, we can be good meta regulators over ourselves and like realizing like our deepest values.
Thank you, Adam. I'm just going to throw up that closing slide, and then we'll hear from everybody who wants to raise their hand with the final note. This has really been an awesome ActInf stream 13.1 and 2. So in the calendar event for those who are participating live, there's a feedback form, a survey, which would be really appreciated. And all of you are always welcome, whether you're the author or not, to participate in a future ActInf stream. You can go to the spreadsheet and find out the calendar, but all of you would be extremely welcome to be in a group ActInf stream like this again. And then if anybody has an idea for an event that they want to arrange, or like an interview or a follow-up discussion, or a few minutes isn't enough during this conversation to talk about drama or consciousness or whatever it happens to be, let's just plan that as an event so that we can always make sure to hold this space for hearing about everyone's perspective, because it's just such a great stew when we can have it all going. So Marco, and then Stephen, and then anyone else who wants to raise their hand on a last note.
Thank you. I agree. This has been very, very enjoyable. So thank you, Danny. Scott, thank you for the nice metaphorical pictures. So I fully agree that there's this beautiful notion of the feelers, right? But I think it's also interesting to first distinguish reflexive feelers and intentional or expressive feelers, right? So how do you navigate to the world? And in that challenge, how do you navigate yourself? And so I think personality or your self model regarding you as a person are more of those reflexive feelers. And then subsequently, you are more able to grip or control or regulate the way you navigate the worlds with your perceptual feelers, more specifically the recognition models by which we are able to take in the world, because they are what are being compared with the sense data. And you also said something very nice about, I really like Carnot engines as a picture. I fully love that you mentioned that. And you mentioned information differentials. Now, information differentials is exactly what active inference is about, right? So the beauty is also there's a notion, you mentioned entropy a lot, but there's also a notion of relative entropy, which is also known as the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is exactly what underpins the entire formalism. Because exactly like the Carnot engine, you want to minimize the temperature differential, but in the brain, temperature is constant, right? Similarly, the energy consumption doesn't vary with more than an order of magnitude. And so the interesting question here is, okay, so to what extent is it like a Carnot engine? To what extent does information, just the minimization of information differentials, play a part in this functional behavior? So one very nice notion that I like, which I got from a friend, Zed Burnett, shout out, is coordinated equilibration. So both in the case of normal conventional thermodynamic equilibration, such as in Carnot engines, as well as, in my opinion, for active inference, you're basically equilibrating the whole collection, the complex covariance and co-conditional collection of information differentials. And so no matter what, by virtue of it being physically instantiated, it needs to equilibrate physically, which has some relation with informational equilibration. So in other words, one thing I like to say is basically we're letting nature do the work, right? We're already nature, it has to equilibrate, and it happens that that finding of equilibria is in itself homologous or analogous to particular algorithmic instantiations, which, if you're interested, is also interesting in computer science, because apparently there's some nice works that connect Ising spin models, toy models of magnets, with self-organized criticality, right? How the brain operates via avalanches or cascades of activity. Apparently, these are formally implementable to solve basically most famous algorithmic challenges. So I think hopefully you might find that interesting. Right. So yeah, and so I'm not sure what your exact phrasing was, but I wanted to note that I think it's also a nice picture to imagine that what we're doing effectively. You talked about negentropy. So effectively, what you're doing is basically you're partially deciding how you're going to be imprinted by the world, right? And that's the whole power of the whole predictive picture, because the patterns that are out there in the world are effectively the challenges themselves. So when we internalize the patterns, then we're more gripped or attuned to or have a bigger affinity with the world. So you're exactly right in that regard. Sorry, I forgot the rest of what you said. And in regards for Adam's beautiful point about plasticity of a personality, I also very much echo this kind of criticism slash question of the whole assumption that personality traits is static, right? It's rigid. But I think what he said earlier about coarse graining and what I called bootstrapping kind of maybe is a path to understand better how it shouldn't be seen as so static. Because if it indeed is a bootstrap in a time where it lacks self-models, and basically the accessibility of changing that initial bootstrapping model is inhibited, or it's obstructed effectively, right? Because if you want to reflexively act upon these models, then you need to have a path towards these models, so that you have to act upon whatever influence your personality through layer and layer and layer from superficial to deeper, right? And that's a big challenge. And I think indeed things like toolpaths, things like visualization exercises are one example. But I also really like Stephen's notes on drama and more situated experiments, situated design, where I think the notion of porosity is also very interesting. Right? To what extent do you allow the environment to influence you? And finally, I just wanted to note that because Anna mentioned it, psychedelics, yeah, absolutely, because the whole phrase is psychedelos, the revealing of the mind. But that's only one step. The second step is reveal such that it becomes accessible to systematic change. So those are my thoughts, and thank you for giving me these thoughts.
Nice. It's really great how you tied so many of those elements together. So in the last couple of minutes, just quickly from anyone who wants to speak, we have Stephen, then Scott, then anyone else who raised, then Adam, then anyone who raises their hand.
I mean, this is what this paper is so interesting about, is the way that it gives this dynamic mechanism, which is good for active inference, but it's also quite an intuitive way to break down all these generative models and different things. It gets hard when you start to layer different areas. I suppose the two things that come up when I was thinking about the comments on the drama or acting is I think sometimes the acting or having a chance to go and do a performative event or action, that's more like you're going on stage, and that could be like that mounting car problem. I don't know if you see the paper of exploring a landscape using your model and seeing different possibilities, so it could extend out the possibilities, and that mounting car problem was quite good for looking at how that issue of expanding out can be important. And then there's also and there's different ways. So for instance, method acting is actually can be quite dangerous. A lot of people have psychological issues if they go down that route. So there's basically the putting on an act is like you're still a performer, and you know that you're in a sort of a field of practice, presenting and being aware of where the audience is, how close they are, what size of you they can see. However, just by doing that, you will have that experience. So you will have expanded your range, your entropy of possibilities or states of the world. But there's also participatory type drama where you could revisit a real life experience and go back into through psychodrama, sociodrama, an actual experience that you had, and look at that. And then that also could give different ways to maybe understand your actual lived life. Now, whether that would change the big five, I don't know. It may not be about changing the big five for someone. It may be something else within that, you know. But so I think it's really, I just thought I'd add that to the conversation. Okay.
Thank you, Scott. And then Adam, then Colin, just in the last couple of minutes.
This is great. Very rich discussion. I like the fact that we raised more things, and this is really the beginning of a discussion than we resolved, and that's beautiful. The tulpa really struck me because it's something where there's an imagination and an internal, which is valorized, reified by the external in a process way. And it really reminded me of law. In law, if you say you have a right, but there is no duty of anyone else to respect that right. Like if I say I have a right to free speech, a right to sit anywhere I want on the bus, and no one else respects it, I don't really I just have words on paper. I really need the duties and the rights. And that dyad, I think, is really interesting, that reification, that valorization. And I started to wonder whether it feels like something like behavioral catalysts or consciousness catalysts, where you have that external and internal element are necessary for that coordinated equilibration that, as Marco was alluding to. So I'm fascinated by the discussion here. I feel like we're just beginning and looking forward to other ways for us to continue, because there's a lot of pieces that we still need to explore, it feels like.
Totally agreed. So we'll have Adam, then Colin, and if anyone has thoughts on where we could explore next or what would be fun to explore, they can mention it too. Adam, then Colin, and a special thanks to both of you authors for coming for both of these conversations. It really made the whole thing come together. So Adam, Colin, Blue.
Yeah, I've been loving this. Thank you, all of you. I'm really glad Marco brought up criticality because it gives me an opportunity to hold forth for as what Colin knows is my religion. And I think this somewhat harkens back to last week's discussion of meditation and mindfulness. So one of the ways I view mindfulness as a kind of like psychological manifestation of self-organized criticality. So it's like there's this edge of chaos or this interregime where you have enough variation, enough disorder to give birth to a dancing star, or rather to have variation for evolution to work with, but then you have enough stability to get this cumulative evolution, to have structure built upon structure, and so on. And so if it's the one regime where evolution is possible, yeah, this is a multi-scale phenomena. This is a universality class. Like, you'll find it everywhere at all scales. And so at the psychological level, whatever you're really doing, in some sense, I think it's going to be involved with respect to optimality. And if one of the things you're doing is trying to, like, for instance, try out something new, and like regulate like the amount of psychological entropy you're experiencing, this basically setting up for yourself this return to this metastable place where you can balance stability and plasticity, where you can sort of ride along the edge of chaos and not fall in or go stray too far away from it. This is, I think, if you want to either maintain your personality or change your personality or work within the bounds of it, this seems to be really essential. And this final thing is, like, I've been increasingly thinking like the way we think of mindfulness is like all wrong, and that rather than thinking of it as like this is a really nice state to be in, and you're watching your breath and everything is like super great, and that's good, but like more like the phase space description and more as process, and rather than like a thing you get, it's a return to like a kind of a necessary home, and really an essential part of cybernetic functioning of balancing stability and plasticity that you're going to need for anything.
Thanks so much, Adam. Colin, then Blue.
I'm glad this whole idea of the edge of chaos came up because, Adam, earlier you said at some point, we're talking about active inference, so talking about free energy, and we don't like surprise. And of course, as soon as I hear that, you know what I think. Well, no, we do like surprise. We seek out surprise often. We like surprises, right? We like uncertainty. We like risk. People enjoy these things. That's exploration. And the reason that we have both, it's I think maybe the most important fact in psychology, that we have an innate ambivalent response to uncertainty and an increase in entropy, which is simultaneously positive and negative, right? We obviously don't like surprise. We fear entropy. We need things to be predictable or everything disintegrates. But at the same time, we like surprise, we like uncertainty, we like exploration. And if we don't do that, then we don't adapt. And eventually we get too rigid and everything disintegrates, right? So you have to seek out entropy in order to avoid eventual catastrophic increases in entropy, right? You have to seek it out and master it. And so that's why you need to be at that line between order and chaos, right? Between order and disorder. And, as Adam's pointing out, that's what evolved systems evolve toward the edge of chaos, because that maximizes the possibility for computation. It maximizes the possibility for adaptation. And there is, to make a segue from the abstract to the more concrete, because I feel like that's sort of like what my collaboration with Adam, it's like I'm tying this to more concrete psychology. He's tying it to more abstract theory. There's a lot of work in the last 20 years in personality psychology on personality change, and especially personality trait change. One of the things we know from this research is that virtually everyone has at least one personality trait that they would like to change. We also know that personality traits can and do change over time. It might not always be easy to change traits. They might not always change, dramatically. But we do see change in personality traits over time. We know that things like therapeutic interventions change personality traits, especially reducing neuroticism. And personality psychologists have recently been trying to develop systematic programmatic interventions to help people to change different personality traits. And of course, a lot of it is through first just changing more specific habits, more specific characteristic adaptations, right? Because that's what, as Adam said, you have more of an immediate grasp on, is how to change your habits, how to change your particular strategies. But it is possible for those to generalize to these more general changes. And I would think of that as, you learn specific things, but eventually those things that you learn may actually tweak some of the underlying general parameters that actually enact those specific things over time.
Thank you, Colin. For those who need to drop off, thanks for coming, just to respect the end of the official event. But Blue, Dave, and then we'll chill for a couple more minutes. But thanks everyone so much for coming today.
So I want to thank the authors, especially for being here and livening up this conversation. But just as far as things that I think we could continue talking about, or that would be interesting to pursue in the active inference framework, are things like personality change, or things that do change the personality, right? Like trauma, therapy, psychedelics, mindfulness meditation. Like all of these things can really have drastic effects on who a person is. Fundamentally, I expect in like terms of Big Five as well. And then also like maybe in a non-active inference kind of way, like the discussion on consciousness is big and heavy, and maybe not for this live stream, but something that is definitely always worth talking about.
Thank you, Blue. Dave?
Yeah, Sean Carroll interviewed Carl Friston a few months ago, and he brought up, I think, the same point that Professor DeYoung just mentioned. Wait a minute, we don't try to be certain about everything. We want novelty. We want to be confused. And Professor Friston became even slower and more methodical and self-critical and self-qualifying than usual, and really was working through all these levels of mathematization that, I'm sorry, in my humble opinion, he's kind of gotten trapped into. That's something that Professor Edelman was terrified about. This incredibly brilliant young kid, and he's going to get his brain sucked by the algebra.
Thank you, Dave. It reminds me, it's controlled novelty. We can't just say more. More is different, is what we say in complexity. And when it comes to cybernetic, goal-driven, edge-of-chaos systems, it's not so simple as just take a linear regression and, more ants is better for the colony. No, I mean, selection has clearly, in different niches, resulted in colonies that have different shapes of everything. So it's a local vector of selection, but then the broader space is actually not quite so linear. So I hear you on that. Marco?
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you mentioned that podcast. It's actually, in my opinion, the best conversation with Carl, because Sean being also Professor Carl, also being a physicist, he really was able to get Carl active and it's more playful and cheerful about talking about it. But I'm not sure what you mean with the getting more quiet and self-critical. I think it's more is awareness that that's really the main challenge in dealing with these kind of seeming tensions or paradoxes, because I do think there's a very important attention to point out when it comes to formal modeling, especially when it comes to formally modeling brains or humans, as we are all too familiar with, which concerns, as seen, for example, in the personality model, and that there are often these complementarities, these trade-offs. And often in folk psychology, in normal communication, we tend to pick a trait or pick a characteristic and just say that's good or bad. It's always decontextualized. It's rarely in relation to the trade-offs, in relation to which they obtain an actual normative value or valid normative value, in my opinion. And crap, there was something else. Oh yeah. So I linked in the on the YouTube chat, but I really personally am very fond of the theme of pleasant surprises, pleasant perturbations, and this controlled these controlled unknowns. For example, well, Stephen's gone now, but he mentioned the idea of spaces, right? So we could imagine, well, first, sorry, it should be more formal. So formally, that's already resolved in 2017, a paper I was happy to be the co-author on, because active inference doesn't concern itself with free energy per se. It's expected free energy, right? And the more sophisticated your models, the more sophisticated your temporal depth and your counterfactual imagination. Imagination is very formal, but I like allowing us to talk about imagination as if it was formal, right? Kind of liberating it from the folk psychological connotations and way too many centuries of philosophy kind of dunking on it, right? Because it's simply because we didn't have the grounding. So it is exactly in active inference that these tensions disappear if we allow ourselves to accept what the mathematics actually say, that there is this kind of trade-off, that there is this kind of complementarity, that indeed it is kind of that hippie notion of yin and yang. And so it's no surprise that stability and plasticity is the method trait, in my opinion. And so, oh yeah, sorry. And I linked that paper from Heilige, who is at the Free University of Brussels and a pretty prominent researcher in cybernetics. And he has a very interesting notion, which I quite like, about challenge propagation. So that's continuing on the theme of pleasant surprises, because we design challenges for each other. Social situations, games, work, all these cultural niches are designed challenges simply by virtue of the fact that they were selected by our social cultural dynamics. We allowed these to persist throughout time in culture, knowing that in their persistence, they enact positive effects on us as we try to adapt to them, right? And so in that sense, I find it very, very beautiful that these kind of controlled unknowns, this controlled chaos is such a prominent theme in how we design each other and allow each other to cultivate. And in that sense, to find another theme, we co-regulate each other. And in that co-regulation of each other, we develop these kind of super personal personalities, which I think, well, hopefully people can agree that we sometimes really feel that viscerally, the kind of personality or vibe, as millennials us like to say. And there's a certain vibe in certain areas.
Wow.
And these vibes tend to resonate with our personalities because we already have these models of this kind of strategies and goals and values we instantiate for particular situations. And so it's not far-fetched that the same models afford us also sense certain personality-like themes in situations, because that is literally the kind of brain system we use. We use a brain system of persons to do this, right? The brain system, somewhere frontal, dorsolateral prefrontal area, we have next to each other the brain area activated when we do self-modeling, and next to that, modeling other people. And so that is also exhibited in how easily we attribute personality or intention to inanimate, super simplified objects, right? And that speaks to, in my opinion, the validity of the core assumptions in this paper, that personality can be decomposed, and indeed that's a trifecta of values, strategies, and goals. Sorry, I went on a ramble. I forgot what I was going to say, but yeah, that there.
Our relational architecture, the way that we talk about organic chemistry, and this chlorine wants to do that, and this galaxy wants to do that. The intentional stance. That relational thinking is so deep, and the way that you put it with the super personality, it's like the Superman is the collective Leviathan. It's not just the better individual nestmate. It's that, and in the context of something that's actually super or supra, like above, not just better. Scott, and then anyone else who wants to make a final comment, but this has been really great.
Marco, that was so beautiful. I was starting to think of the choreography of consciousness. That's what it felt like. It's such a beautiful notion. I always used to tell my kids, now they're in the 20s, I used to say the only time you see reality is when you see paradox. And any other time you're inside a model. And the paradox, and that goes right, the paradox is the reality. That's the reality of our interaction. You're interacting then. You're encountering something. And so that notion of embracing the paradoxical and the dance and the negotiation of it, it reminds me, the last point I was going to make is, it reminds me of the research they did on fish swimming. They took a semi-rigid piece of plastic and they put it in a stream, and they started increasing the speed of the stream. And at a certain speed of the stream, the plastic undulated with a periodicity that was akin to how fish swim. And they realized that fish don't swim through water, they pass through the water. And because the water is causing them their swim. Similarly, that choreography of consciousness is that, right? We don't just situate our cognition, we situate our persona, and it's constructed externally and internally. So the last thing I wondered about is each system Gödelian? So each system is incomplete, has questions within it that can't be answered from within it. And maybe our novelty seeking is an intrinsic recognition that we're all Gödelians, that we need to go outside to find answers. So anyway, great discussion. Love it.
Yep.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks as always
Can I
for
just answer some of those?
coming on, Scott. So let's just go from Dave, Colin, Marco, and then we'll probably call it unless someone else has a burning desire.
The only time we need to be conscious is when we're in that zone of paradox. We ought to understand it, and we don't.
Nice. Colin?
Well, on the same theme, I really like that idea of paradox being reality too, and that's the same as the prima materia of the alchemists, right? It's what is the thing behind everything that gives birth to those things, and it's precisely the thing that we don't understand. It's the thing that's unknown, right? And so that's the chaos that's on the the other side of the border where we're at the edge of chaos. And yeah, especially from the perspective of consciousness, what you need to be conscious of is precisely only those things that you don't understand perfectly already.
Marco?
Yeah, yeah, Scott, thank you. That was beautiful. Yeah, I just wanted to riff on that. So I laughed because I mean, I feel comfortable saying this here. So me and my friends, we were interested in psychedelics. So I find it very, very fascinating that there's a huge variety in what I call idiosyncratic encounters. So a lot of my friends with the psychedelics have this one thing that they feel like, oh wow, that was so fundamental. And one of my friends, let's call her Luta, she had exactly that, right? She said, I couldn't escape the idea that everything is paradox, right? And though I won't go into it, but every other such quintessential encounter, idiosyncratic encounter, also, in my opinion, relates to something formalizable in terms of active inference. And I really, really like a notion of choreography of dance. I use the metaphor a lot too. You might also be interested in Fritjof Kapla's work, who also wrote Tao of Physics, and he also had this moment of insight about physics simply being this dance, right? He used the metaphor of Kali, a deity in Hinduism, but more formally and interestingly. Well, my attempt to formally make it interesting is, as we noted, right? Cybernetics acts upon configurations of models simply because systems are composite or compositional, distributed, and constantly reorganizing. So at the very least, we can say that it's about configurations. Yet, going back to an earlier thread, if conscious indeed is intermediating cybernetics, then they need to intermediate the balancing or the meta configuration of configuration, which themselves are constantly changing. So exactly in the example you took with the fish, they are embedded or immersed in fluid dynamics, right? There are flows, and I say that formally, these are informational flows. So they're immersed in all these flows, and they need to find, or that space needs to find, the space needs to situate itself in between those flows. And by virtue of doing that, it is regulating them, right? And so I think that's a very beautiful idea. And the last thing I think is also very beautiful. So we're all Gödelian, right? We're all incomplete, which reminds me of conversations I've had with Simon Dedeo, a researcher at SFI Institute. Very, very good researcher, very interesting. Has some very, very nice work on Bayesianism and the nature of knowledge. I think I said to him exactly what you said, right? This all Gödelian, but how I phrase it is, we're all each other's oracles. So an oracle, I'm not sure if you know in computer science, but they give you an answer that you can't actually compute. But if you would have the answer, then things would become easier. So it is by virtue of we are incomplete, and that is allowed because other people's incomplete systems can act as an oracle for us. And so I think that's also something that speaks to our experience of how we're aware of certain things, but it's in fact actually very incomplete. But we trust that it's okay to be incomplete. And if you're interested in that, then I'm sure you know Hofstadter, Gold Bach, Terence Deacon, Incomplete Nature, as Adam mentioned, and Dedeo, as I mentioned. So yeah, thanks so much. That was very stimulating.
Great.
I hope you found that interesting.
I close it with a William Blake quotation he wrote in his notebook. Do what you will, this life's a fiction and is made up of contradiction.
They're beautiful. I applaud to that.
Peace out, everyone. Thanks for participating. Thanks for watching it. Hope to have more participation. Join the stream if you're not on it already, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for hosting this.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.